Hi, my name is Rachel Phillips and I'm the Director of Peers Victoria, and I'm going to talk a little bit today about stigma. So I think people know intuitively what stigma is about, and many people have experienced it. It's the process by which someone is reduced from being seen as usual and part of the norm to being seen as unusual, devalued, and discounted. What happens is people are marked as different. They become seen through stereotypes, and because of those stereotypes they'll experience status loss and discrimination, and the stigma is seen as the primary or dominant identity through which they are to be known. So if you don't understand the experience of using substances or being involved in sex work, if you meet somebody who's a sex worker who's substance dependent, you'll think that is the most important feature of their identity, which of course we all have multiple things going on in our identities and experiences. But when people are seen through the lens of a stigma, all of those other features of who they are become reduced to the stigmatized aspect. The types of stigmas include identity stigmas, so this can apply to like race, ethnicity, belonging to a certain sort of subpopulation or cultural group. Behavioral stigmas, so this could include sex work is a behavioral stigma to some degree. Doing things that are against the criminal code would cause one to be stigmatized. Yeah, there's a number of things one might do that are seen as outside the norm. So those are behavioral stigmas. Health stigmas can include, contagious illnesses are oftentimes stigmatized. We certainly saw this with HIV. Other bloodborne or sexually transmitted infections might be stigmatized. Chronic or terminal illnesses are often stigmatized. Mental health is very stigmatized. So lots of health stigmas. And body stigmas, which often sometimes relate to health stigmas, could include the shape of one's body, the look of one's body, abilities, all sorts of differences in relation to the body that are stigmatized as well. Stigmas often overlap, actually. It's not always that it's really neat and tidy. And one of the ways that stigmas are upheld is that stereotypes around one stigma will draw on other stigmas to uphold that negative viewpoint. But stigmas have the strongest effects on the stigmatized person, but it doesn't stop there. All those that are in relation to someone who experiences stigma will also feel the effects of that stigma to some degree. This is called courtesy stigma or stigma by association. And most often this is studied in relation to parents of children with different abilities or illnesses. That's where some of the literature comes from, but it's also been studied in relation to like having a spouse or partner who's incarcerated. Well, I did some work on the area of like just even working in the context of a stigmatized population. So like at Peers, we work with sex workers, and to some degree, the stigma attached to sex work becomes attached to the organization and all those who work within it as well. But yeah, stigma spreads out, as Goffman said, in waves of diminishing intensity to all of those that come in contact with the stigmatized person or population. Compound stigmas. So our identities and social and physical experiences are shaped by many factors simultaneously, and people will consequently also experience interacting and compound stigmas. So being Indigenous, for example, and working in the sex industry is an example of a compound stigma, or being trans and working in the sex industry is an example of a compound stigma. Earlier, I referred to how people will uphold negative viewpoints by layering stigmas, and so the sex industry, for example, has always been like associated with contagion or communicable disease. It's been associated with problematic substance use. It's been associated with the corruption of marriage and the family. It's also, there are special types of narratives that I think are reserved for people who are racial minorities in the sex industry, or gender minorities in the sex industry. So those are examples of the layering or compounding of stigmas. maybe in some cases used to add more negative weight and value to a stigma, but also people literally experience like multiple stigmas in their lives and are managing multiple stigmas. Not all stigmas carry the same weight, nor are they perceived the same from context to context, for example. So stigma, in large part is about the perceiver. When you know somebody who, or you're part of a community that's stigmatized, you at some point stop seeing those attributes as a source of difference or something that should be negatively valued. So it depends on what political and social context you're in, how a stigma will be seen or viewed. Some of the effects of being stigmatized, or negative effects of being stigmatized, are not seeking services or information, withholding information, living in secrecy, inhibiting one's identity or expression, withdrawing from social contexts. There are many very obvious and subtle ways in which stigmas are upheld and managed in social interactions. So people will sometimes enter into social interactions but use passing, which is where a stigmatized identity is suppressed, or covering, where you don't share certain information to not draw out that negative response from the person you're interacting with. And for example, many sex workers will not tell their physicians that they're in the sex industry. Are stigmas fixed and unchangeable, or are they experienced the same? No, not at all. They're the same, different individuals experiencing the same stigma will experience it differently based on other experiences in their life, who their social network is, who their maybe their education. There are a lot of factors, both individual and social factors, which can shape how a stigma impacts a person or how it's perceived. And those things can change over time too. They're not, we see stigmas actually change over time. At one point it was much more stigmatized, for example, to be gay or lesbian than it is today. It does take a lot of time to reshape stigmas, and some stigmas really are resilient to change. And I would say, sex work might be one example of a stigma that, despite lots of activism over 30 years is still quite stigmatized, although I do see change in that area as well. The harm reduction movement has really worked to reshape the stigmas that are attached to substance use. There's multiple examples in society of where social justice or activism work has reshaped how a person experience or some other manner of stigma is perceived. What helps people to cope with stigma and to contribute to this positive social change? Well, one is public education, telling stories of lived experience. This is really hard work for the person who has to do that and has to share their experience sometimes, and in the process be exposed quite directly to people's stigmatized ideas. But it is one of the important ways that public education can occur and people can shift their ideas. One of the ways in which stigmas are upheld is by having distance from, being ignorant basically about something. So once you get to know people or you get to know about their experience, that can lessen a stigma. So that storytelling is an important piece of it. Education and research. Rewriting the story, arm yourself with evidence, lead based on experience. So understanding the experience of something, being able to communicate the facts. These are areas in which, research and systematic sort of information collection and then, relaying that knowledge back out into the public can be really important. So, when someone says, all sex workers are victims of gender-based violence, knowing how many people have experienced gender-based violence and then how contextualized that is and how different people perceive their labor in the sex industry and a whole host of other things can be powerful ways to refute those stigmas and to educate. So education and research is important. Working, living, and hanging out with others who experience the same stigmas. So, you know, not necessarily all the time, but this is a powerful way to insulate one from the harmful effects of stigmas. And I read an article once on how, you know, why that oftentimes immigrant communities from, you know, similar ethnic background or racial background will live together in you know, similar geographic spaces, and it's because it has a big impact on reducing the discrimination and stigma people face as newcomers to a place. Form coalitions across stigmas. You know, one of the ways in which stigma works is it sort of separates the person as different and isolates them. But if to the extent that, like, a lot of times there are common social justice issues across stigmas, and there are common interests, and so there are reasons and ways to reasons to form coalitions, and those can be powerful ways to confront stigma. So if you look at the BIPOC movement as a modern day example of people of different racial ethnic backgrounds coming together to challenge racism in society and colonialism. Gender and sexual movements, sex workers have found a lot of common ground and interests with the labor movement, for example, harm reduction and drug user groups, gender and sexual diversity advocates. Yeah, so, you know, allies and coalitions can be important ways to help address stigmas. Allies are important. I'll just end with a sentence about them. They can help to access new audiences for movements, and they can sometimes do that public education work on behalf of stigmatized populations, and they can help carry the workload and share in public education. And I think of Moms Stop the Harm as being one sort of like kind of an ally group, but they're a family group, but not directly stigmatized, but definitely would be feeling the effects of courtesy stigma and have lost loved ones, but really are a powerful advocacy movement for addressing the stigma of substance use and the crisis of the overdose crisis. So thank you.